open this special meeting of the Historical Commission to order. Our order of business tonight is a presentation on the Woods Hole District Planning Study that the Historical Commission has commissioned from the Cape Cod Commission. And our host, Sarah Cordiff, will explain it to you and tell you what they're doing and what the intention is and the objective and what we're going to get out of this as a community.
Right. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Are we in the way if we sit here?
No, you're not in the way, but you may find it easier to see if you
Okay.
switch around. All right, thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight. My name is Sarah Korjeff. I'm a preservation specialist and a planner with the Cape Cod Commission. And you can't hear me?
Yeah, you're not mic'd very well.
Do I need to, I have a mic. Do I need to move it to another spot?
Is there a volume adjustment on the thing that's in your pocket?
That's a good question. I was handed this.
And there usually is volume on them? Or make sure it's on?
It is on. I do not see a volume adjustment. I'm hoping that the folks. All right. Are we okay? Does that help?
No.
Oh,
The microphone's just for television.
right. So,
If you want it to be amplified, you have to use these,
aha.
which are the libraries.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Do you know how to?
So that definitely needs to stay
Okay.
on there.
Yeah.
You could turn the volume here too.
Okay. Thank you, Corey. All right. Now with our technical difficulties taken care of, I'll start
You
again.
have to hold it, Sarah.
What's that? This? All right. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Thank you very much for coming tonight. My name is Sarah Korjeff. I'm the preservation specialist and planner with the Cape Cod Commission. And tonight we're gathering here to tell you a little bit about the Woods Hole planning study that we've been doing at the request of the town of Falmouth. The goal is to tell you about the information we've gathered thus far, tell you some of the things we've noticed as we've been gathering information about the area, and then to get your feedback. So the way we're going to work this evening is a little introduction right now. Then we're going to move on to a presentation about 20 minutes long. It's sort of a condensed version of a presentation that we've already given to the Historical Commission with just a few alterations. But then we're going to break all of you into 3 groups, and we're going to separate into the 3 tables in the back of the room where we'll discuss specific topics for about 15 to 20 minutes. Everyone will cycle through each of those 3 tables, so you'll all have an opportunity to give some comments about each of the 3 issue areas. Then we'll have a brief reporting back. I should mention that each of those tables we have 2 facilitators at, also staff from the Cape Cod Commission, and also the town assistant town planner, Corey Pacheco. And then finally, we'll turn it back over to the Falmouth Historical Commission, and they'll sort of guide any final comments and discussion at the end of the meeting and do sort of a wrap-up. And then also we can talk about where we go from here. But I'd like to start just by describing the study area. So in this map here, the dotted white line shows us the historic district boundary, and the solid line is the study area boundary. So the goal in putting this study together was to include most, if not all, of the historic district, but to cover areas beyond the historic district boundaries, to really look at more than just the area in the historic district. So we have 3 areas of focus. One is to look at existing zoning and the community character, visual resources, the character of Woods Hole Village. The second is to look at historic resources in the village, to talk about the resources that we have that are protected and the resources that are not. And thirdly, to look at bicycle and pedestrian amenities in the village and issues related to that in terms of bike and pedestrian safety and just travel through the village. So in this agreement with the town of Falmouth, when we were approached by the town and agreed to do this study, as we do in all of the Cape communities when we come in to do a study like this, we start off with putting together a scope of work. So this is where we specifically identify the 3 issue areas that we want to look at, and we lay out the tasks that we'll be doing in the order that they'll be done. So task 1 really was doing a lot of background research, looking at prior studies that had been done for the town about the area, also looking at existing conditions. I'll go into that in a lot more detail. And then task 2 is really looking at the regulations that Falmouth has in place today, both in terms of zoning as well as your historic district regulations, and then related to bicycle and pedestrian facilities, looking at what you have on the ground here for them. Task 3 deals with sort of our interaction with the town boards and the public, gathering input. So it requires this one that we have a public workshop to gather as much feedback from the general public as we can. It also spells out the number of meetings that we have with historical commission members, and also how we present our final reports back to the town. And finally, task 4 is developing recommendations and bringing them back to the town for your consideration to decide how you want to move forward. And we'll go into those in a little more detail later. So we like to start off often when we do these studies showing you some aerial photographs of the area, and it's just sort of a reminder of how much these places have changed, can change over time, and what some of the key changes are. So these aerial photographs show us the years 1952 on the left, 1971 in the center, and 2002 on the right. And you can see the study area outlined in black in all 3 of those. I think one of the major changes that we can really see in this Woods Hole study area over that time frame is the change from the rail terminus at the water to, which you can see in the 1952 photograph, and the bottom here sort of takes this area and blows it up. So it's a little easier to see. So there you can see that the rail line was still in place, but 1971 it had switched over to ownership by the Steamship Authority and had become a large parking area and facilities for the ferry travel, much larger facilities for the ferry travel across to the islands. Some of the other things we really see as we look at these 3 photographs are some additional residential development in the greater Woods Hole Village area, and we also see some real growth in the institutions that are centered around Eel Pond and MBL and Hui. But I want to walk you through a series of existing conditions maps, which many of which we also have posted along the walls in the back of the room, so that when we get to the breakout groups, you'll have an opportunity to refer to them in more detail if you wish. First, looking at existing land use. This map shows us what's on the ground today, not your zoning, not the zoning regulations, but actually what you have on the ground. And I think one of the things that really makes Woods Hole Village very unique on the Cape is the amount of educational institutions that you have in the village, and just how much of the area that they're occupying. So here you can see everything shown in blue is educational. Everything shown in the purple is a government entity, whether it's the Steamship Authority or the U.S. Coast Guard or the town of Falmouth. And then you have a relatively modest amount of commercial uses, which you can see centered really right in the downtown to the east of the drawbridge, but also some to the west of the drawbridge, and a couple of outlying commercial properties that are primarily either hotels, motels, or institutional uses that, for one reason or another, are actually classified as commercial, and so shown in red there. All of the yellow is residential there. And you can contrast that a little bit with your existing zoning regulations in the area. And here you can see the red zones are the business zones. You can see that that downtown area that has commercial uses is actually zoned for business, but also the entire Steamship Authority parcel is zoned for business. You can also see that a little bit to the east, that there's the property that hosts the Woods Hole Dome is currently zoned business redevelopment, and that's a different type of zoning district. And so we like to, well, and I should also mention that you have 5 different residential zoning districts shown here. If you don't count the golf course area, then it whittles down to 4. But there are a number of residential zoning districts here that all have slightly different regulations. So just to call out the differences, some of the differences between the existing land use and what the zoning regulations allow, it's sometimes helpful to see that there is a difference. And here, as I mentioned, the Steamship Authority parcel, you can see in the left-hand image is shown in purple. In the right-hand image, you can see that most of it is zoned for commercial, is shown as red. Also, the southerly portion of it is actually zoned for residential. And I guess when we point out things like that, it's just to think about what could happen in the future. Maybe the Steamship Authority parcel isn't the best example, but there are other places where what's allowed by zoning and what's currently in place are different. And it just means that as the community continues to change, that could be an area of concern. I guess the smaller circle here highlights that business redevelopment district, the zone, the property that hosts the Dome or the Nautilus. And there on the left, you can see that it's shown as residential development. And then on the right, what zoning allows is the business one district. I'm sorry, the business redevelopment. In terms of ownership, again, pointing out the number of parcels that are actually owned by institutions or government entities. You can see there's an awful lot of land in the village that's owned by WHOI, MBL, Steamship Authority, Town of Falmouth, and the U.S. government, either through the Coast Guard or NOAA. So that's an important thing to recognize. We know that having discussions with all of these groups is an important piece of planning for the future of Woods Hole. Also, it's important to acknowledge the flood zones in the area. The areas shown in orange here are what's called the VE zone or the velocity zone, where there's a lot of concern about if there's flooding, when storms actually have any velocity or sort of power along with wave action. That's primarily not impacting existing buildings in the district. But you will see that there's a very large area that's in the A zone where there would be, where there's a significant concern about flooding and when water level rise. And pretty much the entire area around Eel Pond, specifically to the northwest and south, would be impacted by that. And we do know from speaking to folks who've lived there for a long time that that's nothing new to them. That they're very aware that that's happened over time, and folks have had to relocate for periods of time in the past. So getting into a little bit more focused on historic properties, starting with the Candle House here, which I think we all found at the commission staff is one of the most iconic buildings in the study area. So one thing we want to point out is the issue of the historic district boundaries. So your existing historic district, as shown with the white dotted line, was established in the mid-1970s, and it was set to be about a 200-foot setback from specific roadways. When it was first created, the district really only included the north side of Woods Hole Road from Harbor Hill Road down to approximately School Street. And then in the mid-'80s, the district was expanded to the boundaries that you see today. So you can see it extended up School Street, down Church Street, partway down on Juniper Point. But because it had that 200-foot setback from these designated roads, there are large areas of parcels that are not included in the district. And so this slide shows you in orange or reddish color all of the lots that are split by the district boundaries. So they have part of the lot is within the district, parts outside, And in a number of cases, that means that a particular property might have some buildings within the district boundaries and some buildings outside the district boundaries. I think in Woods Hole that we found a lot of these properties that are split, the buildings that are set well back behind the district boundary, they're not really clearly visible at this time from the roadways, but many of them are visible from the water. And if the vegetation were to significantly change, if it were to go back to the way it was 50 years ago or so when there was a lot less vegetation, then it could be that these buildings would become very prominent again. But I think the bigger issue that we're finding really is not just the number of properties that are outside, that are on these lots that are split by the historic district boundary, but it's the number of properties that are just plain outside of the historic district as a whole, or any of those properties that were just identified. And to illustrate that to you, this is a map showing all of the historic properties in Woods Hole that have been inventoried by the Massachusetts Historical Commission, essentially. It's what's called their MACRIS database, which means that there's an inventory form for each building. Each of these colored buildings, shown in yellow and orange, are within, or I guess it's showing that way. See, I'm looking at a screen that shows orange and red, but I'm seeing it looks more yellow and orange up where you're looking. So all of those properties have a historic inventory form on file with the Massachusetts Historical Commission. But all of these properties, shown in red, also all have historic inventory forms. They've all been identified as significant historic properties, but they're all outside of the boundaries of the district. So there's a lot of buildings. And there are two color tones just to denote that some of these buildings have individual inventory forms and others have an inventory form that deals with a group or a cluster of buildings. So that's really the most significant feature we found in terms of historic resources, just the number of resources that don't have any kind of protection at this time. There are a couple of ways we wanted to sort through all of these buildings that are outside the district as well as inside the district, looking at their significance. And one way is to look at the street impact, sort of the presence that these buildings have on the street, the amount that they contribute to the character of the street, and also their architectural significance, so looking at it from a historic and architectural perspective. And so this is a Cape Cod Commission staff assessment, and would be interested in comments afterwards when we are going to breakout groups if people have questions about this. But it's meant to show these two elements, sort of visual impact analysis. One on the top half of each circle is meant to show the level of street impact of the individual building. So if you see it red, then it has a very strong street impact. It's either very close to the road, it has it's very sort of strong presence on the road edge, and down to buildings that have a low impact, maybe they're set further back or they just don't have a very prominent position on the road. Versus on the lower half of each circle, we're trying to illustrate the architectural significance of each of these buildings, whether it has a significant architecture or whether it's a much more modern building and maybe doesn't have a significant character impact on the district. So you can see there's an awful lot of properties that have these darker red tones, meaning that they have either a high character impact on the street or they have a high architectural significance that are located both inside and outside of the historic district boundaries. Another way to look at the significance of the historic resources is to look at the age of the buildings, acknowledging that we don't have that many buildings that are from the very early eras. And here you can see again the dark red highlights the oldest buildings in the district. There are a number that are shown in the darker colors that you can see that are outside the district boundaries. I should mention that this data set is, this information about building age comes from the Massachusetts Historical Commission, their MACRIS database, so these historic inventory forms. And I think the downs, so it's good information. We know it's based on research done by consultants. The only downside is that we don't have this data for every building within the study area. because not all the buildings have had a historic inventory form done. So the other place we can turn is to the assessor's data to figure out the age of buildings. But we have to do that cautiously because we've acknowledged that the assessors really did not establish their database for the purpose of illustrating the age of historic buildings. And there are a number of places where the age of the historic building does not coincide, the known age of a historic building does not coincide with what we see in the assessor's database. We've got particularly the Candle House, which I showed you at the very beginning, the stone building that's just to the west of the drawbridge. On the assessor's database, if you can pick it out here, it's shown right here as blue, which means built 1951 to 1975. And yet, if we go back and look at it in the Macris database, it correctly shows it there as being from the early 1800s. So that's something we have to be cautious about when we're using the assessor's data. But at the same time, we do know that it's giving us information that's correct in a number of other situations when we didn't have data from Mass Historical Commission. All right, moving on to pedestrian and bicycle facilities. This map illustrates the existing pedestrian facilities, the sidewalks in particular, and looks at the condition of the existing sidewalks in the study area. And you've really got quite a range for everything ADA compliant, so Americans with Disabilities Act compliance requires a certain width and certain slopes in order to access those sidewalks. And then we have sidewalks in fair or poor condition. We also show the double white lines crosswalks, and you can see there's quite a few right in the core of the downtown area near the post office and the commercial buildings, but there aren't really any along Woods Hole Road. And so one of the comments we've heard already is, are there some other locations that we should be providing crosswalks or doing something to facilitate safe pedestrian access in these areas? Then looking at bicycle facilities, both the existing bicycle path and its limited points of access, really. You can access it within the study area. It's really just from the steamship parking lot, or there's an informal bike access on Church Street, which is certainly not easy to get up and down. Maybe for a pedestrian, not so much for a bike. But then also there is a designated bicycle route that goes through the village, mostly on Church Street and School Street. And so looking at those issues about safety, and we're interested to hear from folks whether you're comfortable with the way things are today in terms of bicycle facilities and bike routes. Is it the correct route that's identified? We have taken a look at the Falmouth bicycle plan and note that they have identified some goals for the Woods Hole Village area, in particular improving signage of the routes and wayfinding, and I believe also making some sidewalk improvements too. Then moving on to the issue of community character. Here we looked at sort of the visual character of the study area and tried to identify areas where the buildings were sited differently, or the scale of the buildings, or the way they're sited in relationship to the road, or just the architectural character of the buildings changes. And so we identified essentially 6 areas, not including Church Street, which does have its own character, but 6 areas sort of as you enter the village along Woods Hole Road, proceed down to the drawbridge, and then sort of make a circuit around Eel Pond, that these are all areas that have slightly different characters. And this kind of comes into play again when we're looking at zoning and whether or not the zoning regulations in terms of building size and setback from the street, whether they mirror what's on the ground today. Because if you like the character that's on the ground today and your zoning doesn't match that, then it could lead to issues in the future with redevelopment. Also, we looked at vistas. Woods Hole is really incredibly lucky to have so many wide open water views. Some of them are more wide open than others. And in particular, we've had our attention drawn to the view over Little Harbor and how it's somewhat obscured by vegetation, but that's an issue that could be addressed if that's something that the community wants to pursue. Also looking at vistas on Eel Pond, both from the east and west. And here, looking down to the south from both the park on the west side of the drawbridge and also from the drawbridge itself. And acknowledging that really the only one of these vista locations that has real public amenities, an area for seating and such, is the park to the west of the drawbridge. And so one question is this something that the community would be interested in trying to increase the amount of amenities that are available for people to enjoy these vistas? All right. So sort of summing up some of the issues and opportunities. The built environment allowed by zoning doesn't always reflect the existing character, so that some of the questions we'll be asking will be about what character features of the village are important to you, so that we can then take it back and consider whether zoning is helping that, fostering that or not. Some of the allowed land uses may not be desirable. In particular, we're looking at the business redevelopment zone. And while there is a covenant on that property that speaks to allowed uses, the business redevelopment zone in the town of Falmouth does allow things like service stations and retail. And whether or not that's what you want to see on that property is another question. We just talked about vistas, the number of historic buildings outside of the district, and how if these buildings aren't protected in any way, then if redevelopment goes forward, it could have an impact on village character. We're going to talk a little bit in the breakout groups about the variety of ways that historic resource protection could be improved, and then also potential improvements to bicycle and pedestrian facilities to improve safety. All right, so our goal now is to break you all into thirds and to split up between the three tables in the back. And so the one to my right is the table that will talk about historic resources first. In the far back is the table that will talk about zoning and community character issues. And to my left is the table that will start off with bicycle and pedestrian amenities. And the goal, what we'll plan to do is have about 15 to 20 minutes at one table. You'll be asked a series of questions, and we're going to be marking up some maps. And then at time, we will call time essentially and ask everybody to move counterclockwise to the next table, where you'll be asked a group of questions on that next topic. We'll cycle through the three tables that way and then come back to the group format we have right now, where we'll talk about what we heard from folks and what comes next. All right, so I'm going to ask the people sort of on this side of the room to go to the right-hand table, the historic resource one. The people in the middle, if you could go to the table in the back, which is dealing with zoning and character. And the people on the left, if you could go start off at least with the bicycle and pedestrian, and we will go from there. Now we get to the point where we get to summarize what we heard from everyone. And we're going to start by asking the facilitators at the zoning and character table to give a quick report back. Sharon and Chloe, if you don't mind coming up to the front. Oh yeah, you could do it that way. That's better. I can hand you this. Good idea. So it means everybody's going to have to turn around though.
Well, or you can just listen.
All right. All right. So.
Okay, so for the community character map, there are a couple of resounding issues or notes. One seemed to be the vista on Woods Hole Road, across from kind of the motels out over Little Harbor. There seemed to be a lot of support for a park or better amenities there, benches for pedestrians. A lot of people noted that the vegetation there really kind of crowds out the sidewalk that does exist and causes a lot of problems, and as well as the vegetation blocking the view there. So a lot of people mentioned that cutting that back or trimming that would help a lot. Stairs down to the bike path were also mentioned as a idea there in a couple of the groups. The other kind of big issue I would say is the Nautilus or Dome property was mentioned, just in terms of concern for how that might change the character of the area. There were a couple of other kind of smaller areas or properties where people mentioned a little bit of concern about bigger development going in. So that's something that we might look at. And then there is also there is some concern about the changes to Steamship Authority, as well as the Coast Guard buildings on Little Harbor and how those will obscure views there. What else? There is also some mention of kind of making the vista on Eel Pond on the eastern side a bit better by trimming back some stuff, although that could pose some issues I've heard with the Conservation Commission. And then we did have kind of some differing ideas of what the clusters of the areas should be in terms of where the gateway begins and what is more commercial and what is not. But overall, it also seemed like people liked the existing character of Woods Hole, and so looking at how you can keep that.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move on to the pedestrian and bicycle team.
Okay.
Go,
All
Lev.
right. Hi, everybody.
Very highly participatory.
We have a lot of comments. I'm proud of our groups. They really worked hard, came up with a lot of very thoughtful ideas, suggestions, helping us identify the problem areas. I'm not going to obviously go through and try to read them all, but I'll try to give you sort of a high-level picture of what we've been hearing. A lot of suggestions about potential areas that would need crosswalks. Also suggestions on safer crossings in some cases, especially on Woods Hole Road where the speeds are rather high. Also comments about the speeds and suggestions about possible traffic calming measures to help slow those speeds a little bit and thereby make it safer for the pedestrians and bicyclists using the roadway. There were some several comments about access to the bicycling facilities, especially the Shining Sea bike path, the difficult grade change there at Church Street, possibly doing some kind of stairs or something that people could get up and down safer and more easily. Looking at extending sidewalks in some areas, improving the sidewalks, especially some of the very narrow and deficient ones. Extending the sidewalk further up Woods Hole Road could also benefit cyclists as well that don't mind traveling a little slower when there's not a pedestrian on the sidewalk. Yeah, we've heard from a couple of the groups, actually I think the comments in all three, looking at the network of roadways down Water Street, what's the other name of the street? The one that goes by the Steamship Authority. And making that, in essence, a giant roundabout, if you would, by making a one-way network of streets traveling counterclockwise. So, I don't know, Martha, is there something other?
What's interesting is that despite all the stickies on the maps, there was a lot of overlap between the three groups. It seems that they've all identified similar issues. There wasn't necessarily consensus on the solutions, but the issues were identified.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't mention anyone's particular, but we do have all your comments, so we're going to be going through these when we get back to the office. So who would be next?
Corey. Would you be willing to summarize? Do you mind?
So we'll summarize the historic resources map, and there was a lot of consensus that there's important buildings that are outside of the protection areas, consensus on potential expansion to Millfield and beyond around Buzzards Bay Avenue. There was some hesitation by some folks of expansion. Also around Willis, not Willis, there's a cluster of buildings that are unprotected right at the beginning of Woods Hole, at Woods Hole Road. And we also discussed issues of, maybe not actually extending the district, but there are other ways of protecting scale, character, potentially expanding the scenic roads bylaw, protection of street trees, vegetation that actually kind of will tie neighborhoods together. And also expansion over on Water Street on the other side of the drawbridge, west of the drawbridge. I think there was definitely a lot of consensus on protecting buildings outside of the district, or at least consensus that there are a lot of important buildings that are currently not protected.
Great, thank you. That's good. Right. Thanks, Corey. Yeah, and I'll say, just since I was at that table too, that I think the first thing that got circled as an important historic building in each of the groups was the Airplane House. So, and there were several others that came right after that, like Knobska Lighthouse and things like that. All right, so now we've reported back. Hopefully you heard your primary comments reflected in what sort of in the summaries, but all of the comments that we got we're going to take all those back and begin working them, and it will probably lead to a bunch of questions. There'll be more conversations, but I'm going to turn it over to the Historical Commission, to Ed Haddad for now, to just continue the discussion a little bit. I'm not sure. It's only a little after 7, so I'm sure we've got time to continue the discussion for a little while and go from there. Thank you.
If there was, maybe just before I get started, you might see if there's any specific concerns or comments. So if there's any specific concerns or comments from the public of
you
the
want to use this one? Sorry, Ed. I guess we're going to pass it around.
No, we have this one.
This is for the TV. Okay. Jess, I'd like to open it up to see now, after we've gone through the process from the public, is there any comments about the process itself? Did you feel it was inclusive, enough time? Is there any particular comments, feedback from you guys now that we've done this? Sure, go ahead, Ray.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
No one mentioned, I think it's is this on? No. It's got a green light. Is that right?
Yes.
Anyway, no one mentioned 40B. Is that right? Is that the if you don't have 10% workforce or low-cost housing, then your developer can ride roughshod over Falmouth zoning and probably over historical zoning. So I think that whatever Woods Hole can do to provide affordable housing is one way to enable you to protect its character.
Thank you. Good point. Any other comments from the public? Madam in the back? Yep.
I know the preparation for this was enormous, but it would have been so wonderful to have photographs of some of the streets, because we can talk from our memories, but some of them have changed, some of them are very important as they are. Just to see what the place looks like would be very helpful.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Just a question going back in history. How was the historic district first defined? Who was involved? What was the process? I mean, all what we were going through tonight, that was running through my mind. Somebody had come around later than that. And a related question, who drew the study line? And why was the study line drawn the way it was, leaving out the airplane house, for example, leaving out Nopska Light, and just trying to understand the whole process a little better.
Do you want to do that, Sarah? I know you probably weren't involved with how properties were picked, but the process of establishing a historic district is documented. There's a standard process which Sarah can speak to, I think.
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple of components to your question. So when the historic district was first created, I think Woods, it was created at the same time as all the other historic districts in Falmouth, or not, as a lot of other historic districts. And I think Woods Hole was actually kind of the forgotten child of those historic districts because it was a very small area that was designated initially in Woods Hole. And it wasn't until about 10 years later that they expanded it to the district boundaries that you have today. In terms of I don't know enough about the actual process. I've been told that there were a lot of groups that were really uncertain about whether they wanted to be included in the district boundaries. And I think the reason that we see a boundary that doesn't include all of the historic properties in the village is because there were certain property owners that argued against being included at the time. And I think one of the comments that came up at our table was, it's been 30 years or more since then, and so we've kind of got a new generation that maybe is paying attention to this now, so maybe there's a different opinion, so it's appropriate to be reconsidering the idea of what the boundaries should be. But that said, there are a lot of other possible ways to protect historic properties, and we can be exploring those things. What did I miss? Oh, the study area boundary. To be honest, when we were asked to look at the study area, there was not a real science behind it other than to say they wanted us to look beyond the boundaries of the historic district. So you'll notice that we've done some existing conditions analysis outside of the study area boundary, because when we drew the line first and then got out into Woods Hole, we realized that it wasn't always a logical place to have drawn the study area line. So we've stepped over that line and included some other areas within it. But we did include the airplane house. We did know that going in. So.
But you kept there were some split lots that remained split lots.
Well, that's one of the big questions.
That were partly in and partly out? Is that what you're saying? Of the study area?
Yep.
Okay. I think at the time we weren't aware of where all of the split lots were.
Any other questions? Okay. I'd just like to make a comment that obviously we're at the beginning of this process. Sarah and her group has a lot of work to do now. They have a lot of information. Certainly they have to process and come back to us at some point in time in the short time future, I hope. They're going to come back with recommendations based on their findings, based on public input. Now, I just want to stress that this is not meant to be a historical commission objective or project. We recognized a need based on the historic district and our discussions within the group. Nicole, who is a resident of Woods Hole, brought her concern to us. We agreed with her. We liked it. She had a great recommendation. We brought the Cape Cod Commission. But this is not for us alone. This really is for you. And we appreciate and want and encourage public input. So the process now, you've been involved with it at this point in time. We're going to take your inputs and evaluate it and use it and respect it. But at some point, we still want you to be involved. We want you to be involved with the selectmen. We want you to be involved when the Cape Cod Commission presents the selectmen. We want you to be involved at our meetings when it's presented back. We want you to continue to be engaged in this process because that's what's going to make it happen. Without that engagement and that support of the community itself, some of these things may not happen. So I really encourage you, this is not the end of your involvement. This is just the start of it. Susan?
One of the things I think that will be important is not just where the historic district boundaries may move, but also what those other protective actions are, because as we all know, there's always huge opposition to historic district boundaries, and people are afraid it will negatively affect what they're able to do on their properties or their property value and so on and so forth. In this case, I think what would be really useful to the public is to know what's the whole basket full of ways that property and vistas and so on and so forth can be protected beyond just changing the historic district boundaries.
And I think we will hear those in the report if the recommendations are how do we better protect more of the historic properties in Woods Hole. Obviously the options are historic district, item B, item C, and you'll hear them all at that point in time. And it may not be just one or the other. It might be a combination of all of them that works best for different parts of the Woods Hole community, because the historic district is just a part of your community. We want to look at the whole community, the whole Woods Hole village, because it's a unique village, and we're trying to preserve the whole character, not just the historic district. That's why the study area is greater than the historic district. So that's our concern. So think about the whole Woods Hole village character, its uniqueness, and that's what we want to try to, how do we make sure that character and that uniqueness continues on into the future? Did you have anything to say, Nicole? You're as a resident of the village.
I guess I would just say the part about, that why we started some of this has to do with the gateway area, how we look at the village as we enter into it. My big contention that Woods Hole Road especially looks like a highway, so it gets treated like a highway, and how can we change that? And also the point that we created this study and hope to take it to other parts of town. We've learned a lot in this process, and also the value of the data that we have and how it can be interpreted. And I think that can be useful all over Falmouth.
Yeah. So with that, like I said, the process, the next time that we will probably see something back from Sarah will be at a historical commission meeting. That's when they will come back to us, give us a summary of what their recommendations are, how they compile their findings, their research, and the results. We will talk about it and come back, maybe still go back and forth a couple of times. I'm not sure. It depends on the report itself. And then at some point, we will present this to the planning board will also be involved with this at some point in time as well, because they certainly have a stake in this, and maybe zoning. But at some point, we will present this to the Board of Selectmen. Obviously, they will have the ultimate review of this plan, and ultimately will be the judges as to what gets implemented, what doesn't, based on recommendations from the various boards involved as well, and the public. That's why I need you to be involved, because it's not going to happen if you aren't involved and you want to make it happen. It's your village, it's your community. If you see things there that you want fixed, you want maintained, it's up to you to make sure that the town knows about it. So your engagement is very important. I can't stress that enough.
I can get this on. Great, thank you, Ed. And I'll just wrap up by saying that all of the presentation that we gave tonight and all the maps that you've seen are all available both on the Town of Falmouth's website through their Historical Commission, and also on the Cape Cod Commission website. Both of those addresses are on the bottom of the screen right now. Whichever one you find easier. The Cape Cod Commission one is www.capecodcommission, then / Woods Hole Historic. Or you can just get to the Cape Cod Commission website, and then if you search for Woods Hole, you'll find it. And then, or if you find it easier to navigate to the Falmouth Historical Commission website at Town Hall, then you can find it through that site too. And we're happy to receive email comments or written comments or even phone calls if you prefer. If you come up with another idea that you forgot about tonight, or if there's some other piece of information you want to make sure we have, please feel free to contact us. You can start by emailing me. It's scorjeff@capecodcommission.org, and I can pass it along to all the other staff who are involved if it's really more in their area of specialty.
Could you spell your name?
Sure. It's so S is in Sarah, and then Korjeff is Korjeff, as in Frank. All right, and I just want to thank everyone for coming this evening. It was great to have so much input. We really appreciate it, and I know it'll help make a better product. So thanks a lot.